Crito, you're here early. The boat's not here, is it? You mean the one that enables your execution? No, it's not. But soon. No, I had a dream. It will arrive tomorrow. Look, Socrates, for the last time, will you stop being stupid? We can get you out of Athens. It would be barely an inconvenience, just like super easy. You can go into exile. Here's the problem, Crito. If we take that there are good opinions and bad ones, then it is generally better to listen to the good ones. Yes? True, Socrates. And you agree that when we are learning something new, the good opinions will come from experts and not random members of the population, right? Yes, Socrates. It would be bad for anyone to take the advice of the Twitter mob instead of an expert, surely. Yes, right, Socrates, yeah. And now, if we make bad choices for ourselves, then there must be some part of us that is hurt or damaged by that. Would you agree? Yeah? So then we really shouldn't listen to the masses, should we, Crito? All your talk of reputations and the children, this is what the masses would think about. We agree that it is not just important to live, but to live well, to avoid that harm and damage, yes? We do. And two wrongs do not make a right, right? Right. And do you think we should keep our promises when we make them in good faith, Crito? Yes. Well then, Crito, if the actual laws of Athens were with us here right now, what would they say about this escape plan? They would say that this plan injures the city itself and that it breaks promises that we have made. And do you really suggest that we are justified just because we think that the state has passed a bad judgment on us? Sure. Then I say to you that this is how the laws would reply. Oh, was that an option, they would say? Did we include that the laws can be ignored at any time by a private citizen just because they think so? You have been raised by us and benefited from us, and you, Socrates, have barely ever left us. What makes you think that you can retaliate against us any more than against your father or your employer? And we represent something far more important and precious than even them. Isn't that true, Crito? Hey, whatever, man. No, Crito. We cannot follow your plan. There is too much at stake. Yeah, all right, fine, Socrates. Fear not, Crito. This is the path. For God points the way. Oh, hell, Internet. The Crito is a dialogue which is set in prison after Socrates had been condemned by the Athenian Senate, but before the sentence was carried out. One of Socrates' friends, Crito, comes to him and makes one final plea for him to leave Athens and go into exile rather than face death. This would not have been impossible and perhaps not even unexpected, although, as Socrates later points out, he could have requested exile as part of the punishment. Why wait until exile requires disobeying a legal judgment? Plato's dialogues do not give us much of an insight into the actual characters of the speakers beyond their general rhetorical style. However, we do see Crito pensive as he watches a blissfully sleeping Socrates. We can imagine that he already knows how this is going to go. The Crito is not a long dialogue, but by the nature that it is a crux point for Socrates, literally life and death in fact, it does show us something very fundamental in the philosophy. Whose philosophy? Well, we cannot really be sure. Crito is one of the early dialogues of Plato, during the period when it is thought that Socrates' true position was maybe more accurately represented. Given how history actually turned out, it does seem plausible that this kind of reasoning was why Socrates ultimately, we might say, chose to drink hemlock. But some things are simply lost to time, and we will never know for sure exactly how much of this is Socrates' philosophy and how much of it is Plato's. If we think back to Truth and Politics, we saw that Hannah Arendt claimed that Socrates' death was a kind of sacrifice, an explicit philosophical martyrdom, and she called it one of the rare occasions when a philosopher is able to manifest the truth they believe by some form of action, thus making a more powerful statement than mere words can achieve. The direct problem at hand is personal connection versus impassive regulation. Crito is representing the personal view. Socrates' friends do not wish to lose him, and they do not wish to suffer the social turbulence that his death may bring. This is what real people living in community with each other would focus on, and an eventual compromise would probably be found. But Athens at that time had become a state, and states have laws, and laws imply that every citizen agrees to be bound by them, or else there is some inconsistency within the polity. Just put a pin in whether that always has to be a bad thing or not, but for Socrates, clearly it is. I have slightly played up his zeal in the recreation above, but it is there in the original. As such, Socrates may or may not present his own opinion in this dialogue, but he definitely also presents a form of Plato's strong authoritarianism in political life. The state, and by extension then the executors of the state, are, by training and temperament, more skilled at steering the ship, and thus we should defer to these sons of heaven in matters for which they are ostensibly trained. Socrates, staking his very life on this premise, demonstrates the purity of his thought. If we consider this in combination with his further belief that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, then this kind of allows us to interpret that what was done to him was wrong. Arendt sees this as a seminal catastrophe within philosophy, on the scale of a religious event, and others have made comparisons between the projects of Jesus and Socrates. For Plato, this state killing of his friend caused him to turn away from action into thought, the vita contemplativa. And this turning away, an action, ironically, dominated philosophy until, according to Arendt, Marx brought philosophy back towards action. Viewed in another way by Nietzsche, the project of Socrates gave birth to the idea that a morality of the powerless was the true virtue, leading directly to Christian ethics. If we return to Plato and the general direction that his thought took in the light of this, then if one is turning to thought as a kind of philosophical devotion, then some idea of idealized forms does seem to naturally emerge out of this. However, if one is also turning towards thought as solace in response to some traumatic event, then it is also fairly easy to see how one might become quite unnuanced in one's devotion. If we return to the authoritarianism that is implicit in Socrates' deference to the laws, Plato, and many others after him, have taken paternalism, or maybe we should say parentalism, as a kind of natural authority and a basis for describing the authority of the state. The same thing was broadly used in the Eastern tradition. However, here in the Crito, the existence of the state is taken to be something even more important than the coherence of the family or the tribe. This near-religious viewpoint on the state is clearly open to question, and even Plato himself preferred to soften it with Socrates' point that a citizen of any state is there by choice. They are tacitly consenting to the laws by their voluntary presence in the state. Now, I am not sure that, even back then, it was easy to simply abandon your life and everything you had known on the basis of some political disagreement. But one thing that was absolutely true then is that if you did disagree with the state on a fundamental level, then the average group of humans could still make a subsistence living in the wilds while travelling in search of a new state or a place to found their own. Today, in our modern mass society, both of these options are simply off the table. Almost the whole world is now carved up to be part of some nation-state or other. And even if countries were willing to let just anyone settle their undeveloped land, the logistics of moving across a world of nation-states are complicated. And that is before you even look at the fact that most humans born today are not taught hunter-gatherer skills for subsistence living, and that is not their fault. So if we do want to accept Socrates' argument for the law in the modern world, then we must essentially sacrifice any vestige of voluntary consent. You obey the laws because your country owns you. Period. And if I might editorialize further for a moment, I believe that the wave of rising authoritarianism in the world today, in various forms, is trying to enforce exactly this mentality. You have no right to question anymore. We know better than you. But do they though? 'Twas ever thus. Whitehead said that all of Western philosophy is just footnotes to Plato, and this is the kind of thing he meant. The problem of the Crito is one of fundamental and practical importance for human life, and Plato is giving us the starkest of dichotomies between two different types of integrity, personal loyalty or political affiliation, and he's asking us to pick our poison. If we generalize further, then we can see that this choice in some form plays out with every single person that each one of us associates with, or not, throughout the entire course of our lives. Does each individual relationship we have matter enough for the acts required to maintain it? So I don't think it's hyperbolic to suggest that this problem affects most of us on a daily basis, especially in the modern mass society. This sounds tiresome. But anyway, clearly Plato didn't nail it, otherwise why the footnotes? In the Socratic dialogues, it is often quite easy to pick out suppressed premises in Socrates' arguments. In the Crito, for example, Socrates assumes that the same judgment will be appropriate for all people in a given situation, or that all judgments are unambiguously either good or bad, or that any judgment at all is capable of correctly taking the nuance of the whole person into account. All these assumptions are quite contestable, and Crito could use them to more vigorously defend the premise that disobeying the law can be justified under certain circumstances. If we are condemned on verifiably spurious grounds, then one might argue that the state has broken its covenant with us first. And while Socrates may try to press the idea that the state has expertise that we do not, it is unfortunately an irrevocable fact of history that there have been times that the machinery of the state has been used in ways that are not to the benefit of other people in the state, nor the state itself, but of power factions within the state. I know, it may shock you to learn this. I imagine this was still true when Socrates lived, and while we can agree with him in principle that two wrongs do not make a right, are we therefore committed to just let evil men evil? What kind of a world would that be, Socrates? However, there is still a part of me that is on the side of the state here. I have a soft spot for technocracy, the government of the skilled, because there is no doubt that the scale of the human enterprise has been hugely increased by the application of systems of thought that are not intuitive to human minds. We make the assumption, of course, that this is a good thing, but in the face of growing complexity in the universe, it does seem like a fair assumption to me. There are things then that we would never have been able to achieve had we not deferred our instincts to a derived set of rules. And to know better how to apply a set of rules is a skill, and skills can be developed. The problem is, of course, that human individuals seem to be functionally incapable of separating their own interests from those of the state, at least in a world in which everyone is still forced to live under the principle of subsistence and status needs. This is the unsolved problem in Plato's politics. In his technocratic authoritarianism, Plato vastly overestimates the ability of a single human or group of humans to achieve mastery of the realm of politics at scale, although we may grant that it was probably easier to think this way in the days of the city-state. I want to briefly mention Daniel Kahneman, who has shown over a distinguished career that even experts in a given field are prone to highly predictable biases that lead them to make unforced decisions that are objectively irrational. And yet still, the very concept of expertise does not appear to be incoherent, not even in a field as complex as statecraft. The Taoist approach to this problem is to approach the world through the lens of ceaseless change. It acknowledges that there will be those that rule, but their rule is transitory, constantly transitory, and they should rule without becoming rulers, if you get me. And no, this is not just some facile contradiction that is meant to sound all mysterious. The Wu forms of Taoism make a detailed exploration of how this may be achieved. The sages do not compose the score for social and political order. The music is the natural expression of the common people. The role of the sages is to listen carefully to the songs of the common people and to orchestrate their thoughts and feelings into consummate harmony. Since the people themselves are the immediate source of communal order, they are, in this respect, the emerging content of the hearts and minds of the sages. The heart and mind is the product rather than the source of the flourishing community. The people do not speak to one another because they have hearts and minds. Rather, they have become wholehearted members of the community through full participation in the communication. Of course, the devil is in the detail here, and this has never really been seen at scale. In Chinese governance, Taoism largely lost out to the more regimented and authoritarian forms that are found in Confucianism, and these models broadly propagated around East Asia, although comparisons between the two are, of course, nuanced and diverse. A brief honourable mention is due to Bhutan's idea of gross domestic happiness, at least in principle perhaps, although even this has received mixed reviews in practice. For the most part, though, the mandate of heaven has remained the Eastern equivalent of the divine right of kings. Let's just finish by taking that pin from earlier. Does the very fact that there are laws morally compel people to act in accordance with them? In a way, I think this is exactly Socrates' position, and Plato's attempts to dress it up in the language of voluntary action can only go so far. So in conclusion, what I take from the Crito is that while it is easy to agree in principle with some of Socrates' naive points, his lack of nuance misses, perhaps stubbornly, the complexity of the system. And it is perhaps then not prudent to follow him to the potential extremes of authoritarian power or slave morality. Socrates is also credited as saying that philosophy involves being as a child. But is that always wise when it is the fabricated human world we are discussing? When we grow up, we put away childish things, do we not? This is a 2,000-year discussion, of course, but my sense of this is heightened by the modern mass society, and that is why it seems to me that this old dichotomy of Plato's is becoming imminent once again. But that's just like my opinion, man. What do you think?